Well, hello, Facebook and YouTube world. It's Jeff Robinson again. I'm going to do another video, and the title of this video is Islam a Religion? This is certainly a topic much discussed in our day. I've done other videos relating to the topic of Islam, and we're just going to have a discussion today. It seems that for some reason in our politically correct society, that certain topics are offhand or untouchable, don't talk about. I'm talking about an ideology. I'm talking about a belief system. Christianity has been critiqued. It has been examined. It has been scrutinized for generations. But for some reason now, in our post 9/11 world, Islam is hands off, I should say, and not allowed to be discussed. So I'm not talking about Muslims. I'm not talking about individuals. I'm not talking about people. We're going to be examining the belief system that some people may follow. It's called the Islam. The title is Islam a Religion? It might be an odd question you may ask, but you'll see as we go into our lesson and progress further. But even the Quran itself answers that question. Because many will ask, is it even a religion? And the Quran surah are their chapters. Surah 319, it states, indeed, the religion in the sight of Allah is Islam. So in the contents of the Quran itself, it answers this question of whether or not Islam is a religion. It says that it is Allah's religion. Let's look at some world religions, just to do some comparisons. Siddhartha Gautama, he's also a Hindu prince, was an Hindu prince. He became the Buddha. In other words, Buddha means the enlightened one, while contemplating the meaning of life under the Bodhi tree. According to Hindu sources, according to Buddhist sources and Hindu sources, Gautama was a Hindu prince, and he was shielded from many of the things of the world. He was shielded from old people, according to their documents. He was shielded from the elderly. He was shielded from the poor. He was shielded from the sick and infirm. And somehow he got outside of his palace, outside of his gates, and he encountered all of these individuals. And then so that set him off to contemplate the meaning of life while he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, the wisdom tree. Then we have Abul Qasim became Muhammad. The word Muhammad means one to be praised. He became the messenger of Allah while meditating within his own imagination in a cave on Mount Hira near Mecca, according to their Islamic sources. And then we also have Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith founded the Mormon Church after a series of visions he claimed to receive from God, Jesus, and the angel Moroni, all according to Mormon sources. And these are considered world religions. So we see then, to answer our question, is Islam a religion? We see that right in the pack amongst the origins of world religions. I just used three examples that Islam indeed claims to be a religion. Let's talk a little more about that. Well, what type of religion is it? Because we hear, again, on our news sources, can't turn the TV on nowadays without sometimes discussing this. Then, of course, there's lots of videos on YouTube. There are many that I follow, many great scholars that discuss this issue. And some of the things you may hear is, well, if Islam is a religion at all, what type of religion is it? Some will say Islam is a peaceful religion. Others say that Islam is a violent religion only. And then, of course, then you have some who say, well, Islam is not a religion at all. Well, what do they mean by that? They talk about it in the sense that Islam is a complete way of life, as if Christianity is not a complete way of life. But unfortunately, the reason why they term it in that fashion, that Islam is a complete way of life, because compared to other religions, sometimes people put their religions on their shelves. And also, unfortunately, in our modern Western cultures, Christianity as a religion is relegated to Sunday morning. You go to Sunday morning, you do your religious duties, you say your homilies, your prayers, you sing your songs, you hear a message, and then you leave that at the church and you come home and you go on with your life and you don't take your Christianity anywhere else. That's why they say that Islam is a complete way of life, because Islam, according to their doctrines, dictates every area of a Muslim's life. What to wear, what not to wear, how to use the bathroom, and how to step into a mosque. All of these things are dictated by Islam. But of course, I'm a Christian, and I believe that Christianity also dictates our life. Christianity talks about marriage between a man and a woman. It talks about how to be married. It talks about how to be good parents. It talks about how to be obedient children. Christianity deals with our work life, our duties to our employers, our duties to as civil citizens in any country that we live in. So Christianity also speaks all these things. Christianity just doesn't tell us how to use the bathroom and how to dress. Islam does that, and that's why they talk about it being a complete way of life. And then there's others that said that it's more of a religious political system. And then you'll have still others who talk about Islam as a totalitarian political ideology. They say it's not a religion, it's a totalitarian political ideology. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, they mean by totalitarian political ideology, most religions formulate the teachings and practices for the adherents. Buddhism is written for Buddhists. Hinduism is written for Hindus. Judaism is written for Jews. But Islam, when they talk about it being totalitarian political ideology, Islam dictates not only what Muslims should do, but also what Christians and Jews, and at the time that it was writing, Zoroastrians. So it set guidelines for people who were not followers of the religion. So that's why they call it a totalitarian political ideology. Well, when we ask the question, is it a religion? Well, it certainly has the components of religion. It has conversion, which they call the Shahada. It has prayer, which they do, most of them, not all, many of them pray 5 times a day. Fasting, giving of alms, which they call zakat. And then they have a deity, which they call Allah. And let's look at these. Not all of these components, but let's just look at one component of that, their deity. Allah. Well, as you see there, that certainly doesn't look very politically correct, does it? All right. My contention is Allah is not God, because we often hear that Allah is God. Allah is the Arabic word for God. And so Arabic speaking people, when they say God, when they say Allah, they're referring to God. Also, we know that many Christians in Arab lands, they also use Allah as the name or the word for God. Well, the reason that is because as Islam grew, that name was imposed even upon Christian communities and even Jewish communities, where the followers of Judaism, Christianity could not use the name of God. They were forced to use Allah. So what does Allah mean? As you see there, my little schematic there, my little symbol, just to make an emphasis. So what does Allah mean? Allah is the God. Now, I'm not an Arabic speaker. There are many scholars. I've read many scholars. I've listened to many individuals who've given this explanation who do speak Arabic. And when you just look at the language, Allah means the God. So it doesn't mean God. Allah is al, which means the, and Ilah, which means God. So Elah is the Arabic name for God, not Allah, which is interesting because it's reported that 25% of Muslims are Arabic-speaking people. So all Muslims are not of Arab descent. As a matter of fact, in Indonesia, which is an Asian nation, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, and there are many others. And then you have other religions, such as in Afghanistan and Pakistan, who speak Urdu, and then in Iran, who speak Farsi, and there are many other languages. But it doesn't matter the language that a Muslim speaks; they all use the name Allah. So that ought to let you know again that Allah is not the Arabic word for God. Ilah, Ilah, is the Arabic name for God. For instance, just like if a person spoke Spanish, then they would say, when they say God, they would say Dios. And then, of course, if someone could speak Greek, they would say Theos. And of course, we know that the word for God in Hebrew is Elohim. And so we see that God understands many languages, and but it's mighty funny that all Muslims have to use the name of Allah, which does not mean God, it means the God. As a matter of fact, Allah is the name of a God. So it doesn't mean just God, it means the name of a God. Let's use an example to show that Elah is the word for God in Arabic. Let's look at their Shahada when we talk about the conversion practices, just like many religious belief systems have a way where people convert to their belief system. Well, theirs is known as the Shahada, and the Shahada in the Arabic goes La ilaha illa Allah Muhammadin Rasul Allah. And in the English, that is, there is no God. So you see that small God, that God is Elah. There is no Elah or God but Allah. And Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So this lets you know right there that Allah is not the Arabic word for God. It is the Arabic word for God, the God, Allah. As a matter of fact, the Arabs, the pagan Arabs, prior to Muhammad starting Islam as a religion, the Arabs used that word Allah, and Allah was they believed in 360 gods. They had 360 gods that they worshiped, and Allah was the chief deity, the principal God. And according to some sources, Allah is the God of that rock that is in that box. You see that box in Mecca that many of them circumambulate when they have their Hajj, their pilgrimage, and Muslims from around the world go to Saudi Arabia or go to Mecca, that is, and they walk around that huge box. That box is called the Kaaba, which just means a big cube. And inside of that box, inside of that black box, there is a rock. Most scholars believe that rock is probably a meteorite. Well, that rock, Allah is the God of that rock. And so it was in the pagan Arab culture long before Islam became a religion. Let's look at Muhammad's religion. And I'm not going to do an in-depth analysis of his religion, because there's many videos that do a far better job than I would do. If I were you, I would go and look at Robert Spencer, and I would look at Raymond Ibrahim, who are Islamic scholars. As a matter of fact, Raymond Ibrahim speaks Arabic, he speaks Greek, he speaks some Hebrew, and so you would contact some of his videos, and you would be well informed on this issue. But I'm just laying out just a outline just for this discussion. So in 610 AD, we see, according to Islamic sources, that Muhammad is meditating in a cave. As we mentioned earlier, the Hira at this time, he is married to Khadijah. He is 25 years old. She's 40 years old. She's a wealthy businesswoman. He has a lot of time on his hands. He no longer has to work. He was in the caravan business. He no longer has to work because she basically provides for him. So he has lots of time on his hands, and he meditates in a cave. And then, according to their sources, he received messages sent down from this Allah through Gabriel. So we see that he borrowed from the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures when they talk about angel Gabriel, although his description of Gabriel was a lot different than the Christian sources. So he claims to receive these messages from Allah through Gabriel to Muhammad. Then he goes out and he starts to preach these messages to his fellow Arabs in Mecca. Because again, according to many of their Islamic sources, Muhammad saw that the Jewish and the Christian communities had an organized religion, but the Arabs had many pagan practices, and so he wanted to have a religion for his own people. So he started going and he started preaching to his fellow Arabs. As a matter of fact, many of them were from the tribe of Quraysh, which he was from. His grandfather and his father were leaders of that tribe. And so he went and started and took that message to his own people. Then he also used some pagan Arab rituals and deities to appeal to them. And of course, when I talk about some of the rituals, which is going to the Kaaba and the various things that they would do, circumambulated, and also the deity he borrowed from them, because he was trying to appeal them to win them over to his religion. Then also he used many Jewish and Christian prophets to appeal to them, to that community, because in this area in Arabia, there were Jewish followers and also many Christian followers. And so he used Adam and Abraham and Moses and Jesus so that he can appeal to that community as he was trying to pass on his message to them. And then he preached this semi-peaceful message from 610 AD to 622. And the reason why I call it semi-peaceful, because according to some of their sources, Muhammad would harass the Arab community because he was monotheistic. He said that Allah was the only God. According to the Shahada, there is no other God, there is no other deity worthy of worship but Allah, and then that Muhammad was the messenger of this Allah. And so he would harass the Arab communities, and he would speak against their practices and speak against their religion and harass them. And many times they would ask his uncle Abu Talib, who was a very noted man in the community. They would ask him, hey, get your boy, control your nephew, calm him down. And they would do the same thing. But as long as Khadijah was alive, who was his wife, and who was his provider, and as long as Abu Talib was alive, who was his uncle, his protector, Muhammad was pretty much shielded from that community, although he harassed them. This is according to Islamic sources. And so eventually, after the death of Khadijah and after the death of Abu Talib, Muhammad fled for his life, and he left Medina or Mecca, and he headed for Medina. This was around 622. It's known as the Hijra, or the migration. And things started to change after that. He went to Yathrib, which was largely a Jewish community. It was a Jewish community, and then within 5 years, he conquered that Jewish community, and he became the head of that area, Medina. Yathrib was a Jewish community. He changed the name to Medina once he came to power. There were primarily 3 Jewish tribes there, and he banished 2 of the tribes, and then the last tribe he conquered. And you can see some videos concerning that. Look up the tribe, the Quraysh, and see what he did. I'm sorry, the Bani Qurayza, Bani Qurayza, the tribe of Qurayza. Look up that and be informed about what he did, horrible things that he did to that. So the first 2 tribes he drove out, and then Bani Qurayza, he did horrible things inflicted upon them, and he became the leader of that whole community. And of course, after he became leader of that whole community, then he goes and he primarily conquers all of Arabia. Let's talk about another topic that's not discussed much in the examination of Islam, and that is the doctrine of abrogation. Well, what is the doctrine of abrogation? The Muslim doctrine of abrogation is the concept that Allah revealed a later verse. The verses are known as ayats in the Quran. The chapters are known as surahs. The verses are known as ayats or ayah, which means a sign. That's where we have in the Shia sect, the ayatollahs Ayatollah, meaning the sign of Allah. So the Ayatollahs are the religious spiritual leaders of Iran, and they are, and the Shiite version believe that they are a sign of God, that they speak for God. Well, that the Quran, the verses are ayats. So what that means is a revealed later verse in the Quran abrogates or cancels out an earlier verse in the Quran. So an older verse may be abrogated and substituted with a new verse if the verses are contradictory, and the one that replaces it is better than the one it is replacing, which is a very interesting concept. As a matter of fact, this doctrine is found in the Quran, because one of the things that many times is leveled against people, they accuse Muslims accuse people of cherry picking the scriptures and going in, pulling out violent passages and distorting the Quran. And they say, well, you don't understand the original Arabic and you don't understand the context. But when we talk about the doctrine of abrogation, we see that the Quran itself teaches the doctrine of abrogation. Surah, which is chapter, Surah 2:106 says this, and this is Allah speaking. This is supposedly Allah speaking. It says, we do not abrogate a verse or cause it to be forgotten, except that we bring forth one better than it or similar to it. Do you not know that Allah is over all things competent? Then another one, Surah 16:101, and this is Allah speaking. And when we substitute a verse in place of a verse, and Allah is most knowing of what he sends down, they say, you, O Muhammad, are but an inventor of lies. So going back to the time, when we talk about context, in the time the Quran was written, over a period of, supposed to be revelations over a period of 23 years, which Muhammad received from Allah via Gabriel. That's according to their sources. And then when Muhammad would say these verses that were sent down for him, sometimes they contradicted. And so the Arabs and the Jews of that community would say, you're inventing lies. And he would say, oh, no, that's abrogation. Allah just sent down a word. And so the later word that is sent down is the one that stands. Let's look at the Quran itself. The Quran it means to recite, or it means a recitation. And according to Islamic sources, when Muhammad met the angel Gabriel, and the angel Gabriel took him, according to some sources, the angel Gabriel took him by the throat and lifted him off the ground 3 times and told him to recite the words of Allah. Other times they say that he squeezed him, depending on what source you read. But either way you look at it, it says that Muhammad was terrified of these visions. It doesn't look like the Gabriel of the Old and New Testament. The Gabriel in the Old and New Testament was a angel who made announcements. He made announcements to Daniel in the Old Testament. He made announcements to other individuals in the Old Testament. And he also made announcements to Mary in the New Testament. He made announcements and showed himself to Joseph in the New Testament, and also to Zechariah, John the Baptist's father. And we never see him grabbing them by the throat and shaking them and telling them and informing them to rewrite or recite something. It was always peaceful. Now angelic beings are glorious, and each time individuals in the Bible saw Gabriel or any angelic, they were afraid. But many times the angelic beings and Gabriel also would comfort and encourage them and tell them not to be afraid. Well, in Muhammad's story, we have Gabriel sort of being a tough guy, almost like a mob boss, grabbing Muhammad, whether it's by the throat or whether it's squeezing him, and he does it 3 times, and Muhammad is terrified. So we see that this is according to them, and this is how the Quran was sent down to Muhammad. And the Quran is split up in 2 periods of Muhammad's life. There are many scholars who talk about how Muhammad, in the compiling of his religion, that he plagiarized from many religions. He plagiarized from Judaism, and not just from the Torah, the Old Testament, as we believe, but many believe that it was from He stole from the rabbis, the writings, the Targums, the other writings of the rabbis, which were not completely accurate. They were commentaries. The Talmud, which was a commentary of the Old Testament, not the actual. So it was a very oral community, and he was a caravan man, and he traveled around. And so quite naturally, he would hear the stories told by Jews of their belief systems, and also told by many Christians. And also, even in the Christian community, was heavily influenced by the Nestorians, the Nebionites, which would be more of a Catholic or Eastern type of Christianity that he was had access to and he's influenced by. So he plagiarized from the ideal of we have where we have our Bibles. There's an Old Testament and there's a New Testament. Well, he has the Quran is sort of set up in that fashion. It's set up in the Meccan verses, which is the peaceful passages. The earlier, when he was in the minority, when he had only himself and a few followers, a few converts, that's where the passages were peaceful. And then the violent passages come in what's known as the Medinan verses. The Medinan verses were written in the latter part of 621 AD, all the way to the end of his life, 632 AD, and they were more violent, they were more boisterous, because by this time Muhammad had fled from Mecca. He's in Medina now. He's now a prophet according to their sources. He's a prophet. He's a king. He's a warlord. He has many followers, and so the story has changed. And all of those people who rejected him in his earlier days, when he said that he tried to bring the message peacefully, those who rejected that message, whether they were Arabs, whether they were Jews, or whether they were Christians, he says all bets are off, and then the story changes. That's why you see the later passages being more violent, more assertive. And so it's interesting to remember what we mentioned earlier about the doctrine of abrogation, because the later verses abrogate or cancel the earlier verses. Let's just look at religion in general, just taking some definitions of the word religion from various dictionaries. It says it's a human being's relation to that which they regard as holy, sacred, absolute, spiritual, divine, or worthy of special reverence. Another definition, the service and worship of God or the supernatural, whatever God that may be to individuals. Also, it means commitment or devotion to religious faith or observance. It is from the Latin word religare. Legare means to bind, or it means to connect. And then when you add the re to it, it means to religare, or mean to rebind or reconnect. In other words, religion is man's attempt to reconnect himself with God. That's what religion is. We know that Christianity is not religion, because it's not man's attempts. Oh, and let me preface that, let me back it up, because some people can treat Christianity as a religion with works and all, but Christianity as itself, as a belief system, is not a religion, because it's not man's attempts to relink or reconnect themselves to God. Christianity teaches that God reached out to humanity. The God of creation became a man and walked on this earth and died for the sins of the world and reconciled the world unto himself. That's what makes Christianity different. All other religions are attempts to relink with God. Well, let's fast forward some time and let's look at how the founders, because one of the reasons why I'm talking about this topic is because people say, well, Islam can't be classified as a religion, because if it's classified as a religion, then we know that America, we have a First Amendment, and the First Amendment protects all religions. So that's why I'm talking about this. So let's go to see what the founders, what they said about religion in the First Amendment. We know the First Amendment of the Constitution. The colonies wouldn't have the Constitution, the federal Constitution, ratified until they had some amendments, so that the federal government would not be a threat to its citizens. And that's what the amendments are all about, is to give rights and protections to the individuals, the citizens, because the 13 colonies were seeing that this federal government was going to be formed, and any federal governments, we know that they fled from Britain, and they fled from Scotland, and they fled from tyrannical governments. And so now that this federal government was being formed, they wanted some guarantees of protection against it. And so the First Amendment is called the First Amendment because it was the first one. It's the most important. And we know how it goes. Let's read it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Notice it says, Congress shall make no law. So the handcuffs are placed on Congress. The handcuffs are not placed on the citizens. The First Amendment is not saying little Johnny can't bow his head in a cafeteria, school cafeteria, and say his prayer. That's the free exercise of the citizen's right. But notice it says the prohibition is on Congress. Congress shall make no law respecting, that's old language, meaning concerning an establishment of religion. Well, what do they mean by religion? You're going to be surprised to find out what they meant by religion. So Congress shall not make a law to establish a religion, nor shall Congress prohibit the free exercise of the citizens' religion, or abridging freedom of speech, which we certainly see taking place in our day. They're doing it cleverly. Congress may not be doing it, but they're allowing Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and others to do it. Or of the press. So Congress shouldn't prohibit freedom of the speech, freedom of the press, or right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievance. Notice again, peacefully to assemble. All First Amendment gatherings and protests are to be peaceful. A lot of times we see, there's been a change, a redefining in our modern culture, to where you have these groups that go out into the streets and they riot, and they throw Molotov cocktails at police, and they throw rocks and bottles and hammers, and they set vehicles on fires. They overturn police cars. They break windows and smash windows because they're upset at what their government is doing. And then the news reports on it and says, well, they have a First Amendment right. The First Amendment, no. The First Amendment guarantees a peaceful assembly to redress grievances. And many times the news media, when they report on it, they say, well, it was a largely peaceful. Well, either it was peaceful or it was not. When you got windows being broken out and cars being set on fire and people being injured and blood running down the faces of the protesters and the police and tear gas, that is not a largely peaceful protest. The First Amendment guarantees a peaceful assembly. But also, that kind of got off track there. Focus on the word religion. Congress shall not make a law establishing a religion. Let's see what the founders meant by, what do they mean by religion? Well, let's look at the word religion. The use of the word religion in the writings of the founders was not referring to world religions in the sense in which we use the word, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, all of that, in the sense that we use it. When they mentioned religion in the founding documents, they were referring to sects, not sex, S-E-X. It's a tough word to say. Sects, S-E-C-T-S, or in other words, denominations, such as Congregationalist, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, Presbyterian, Quaker. They were talking about denominations. When they mentioned religion, they were talking about denominations. How do I know that? Because you're thinking, well, you're not a scholar. What do you know? What do you know with the founders? Well, when I read, I never claim to be a scholar. So many people who watch my videos probably say, well, that's obvious. But I never claimed scholarship, but I do know how to read. And what I like to do is I like to read primary source information. Go back to the individuals who wrote these things. Their writings are everywhere. Go back and read what they said, what they meant by their original intent, rather than some secondary source written 200, 300 years later by some college professor with an agenda. Let's go and see what they meant by religion or denominations. Justice James Wilson was one of the only 6 founders who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He spoke 168 times on the floor of the Constitution Convention. He once said this: "The first and governing maxim or truth in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it." Those who made the statute, those who wrote the law, what did they mean by it? Well, how do we do that? We refer to their writings. Governor Samuel Johnston comments on the First Amendment. He says this. He says, "I know but two," and this is going to give the explanation of what they meant by when it says Congress shall make no law concerning religion. It wasn't talking about world religions. It's talking about denominations. Look at what he says. He said, "I know but 2 or 3 states where there is the least chance of establishing any particular religion. The people of Massachusetts and Connecticut are mostly Presbyterian." Notice he mentioned about establishing a particular religion, and then he goes and describes what he means by religion. He's talking about Presbyterians. In other states, the people are divided into 2 great number of sects. See that, S-E-C-T? Then he goes on and enumerates. In Rhode Island, the tenets of the Baptists, I believe, prevail. In New York, they are divided very much, and most numerous are the Episcopalians and the Baptists. In New Jersey, they are as much divided as we are. In Pennsylvania, if any sect prevails more than others, it is that of the Quakers. In Maryland, the Episcopalians are most numerous, though there are other sects. In Virginia, there are many sects. You will all know what their religious sentiments are. So in all the southern states, they differ, as all New Hampshire. I hope, therefore, that gentlemen will see there is no cause of fear that any one religion, or obviously sect or denomination, shall be exclusively established. That's what the founders meant by religion. The citizens were afraid that the forming of this federal government would mean that one of these denominations would be nationalized. As a matter of fact, if you can go and read about the Danbury Baptists, because Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptists. This is where we get our ideal of the separation of church and state. He uses that language in a letter, in a personal letter to the Danbury Baptists, who had caught wind. They believed, they heard that the Congregationalists were going to be the national religion once this federal government is formed. And so Thomas Jefferson wrote to them and assured them that there was a wall of separation between church and state. It was a metaphor used by a Baptist minister of the early 1700s. And so he used that wall metaphor to say that there was a separation of church and state, and that the federal government would not intrude into the affairs of the church, and that they would not establish a national religion, a national denomination or sect. That's what the First Amendment was all about, in their own language, you see here. Let's see what others say. Joseph Story, in his commentaries, famous Joseph Story commentaries of the Constitution, he said, in some of the states, Episcopalians constituted the prominent sect. So again, he uses it right there. He's Episcopalians, the prominent sect. In other Presbyterians, in others, Congregationalists, others, Quakers. And so he's going on to let you know clearly that the subject of religion was left exclusively to the states. As a matter of fact, back then, some of the states, they had state religions, as he mentions. But he's just guaranteeing the citizens that the federal government would not establish a national religion or sect or denomination. Uh, Even some of the state constitutions reflected this in the language of their constitutions. Let's look at New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, it says, "And every denomination of Christians shall be equally under the protection of a law, and no subordination of any one sect or denomination to another shall ever be established by law." Look at what New Jersey says. "There shall be no establishment of any one religious sect or denomination." And it's referring to Christianity. Connecticut says, "And each and every society or denomination of Christians in this state shall have and enjoy the same equal rights and powers and privileges." Let's look at world religions, because as we see, the founding fathers, when they referred to religions, they were referring to, when they said religion in the First Amendment, they were referring to Christian denominations. But there were many religions, in the sense that we use it, that existed during the time of the foundings. And they understood the value of any major religion to society. But they specifically preferred Christianity as a world religion. So they recognized that there were other world religions. They knew that America was a pluralistic society, and the reason there could be many world religions in America is because of the tolerance of Christianity. Christianity tolerates other belief systems, contrary to what our modern people say. Christianity tolerates atheism. Christianity tolerates Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, all of those things. But on the contrary, on the other end of that, many Muslim countries do not tolerate other belief systems. Majority Muslim nations in Saudi Arabia, the churches are underground. There are no open churches in Saudi Arabia. In many other Muslim-controlled, there's no plurality of belief systems. Islam is the only religion that is to be practiced, and it also is the official religion of many of those Islamic countries. And it's written into their constitutions. Not like that in America, though. Because of Christianity, we have a plethora of belief systems in America that is tolerated because America is a Christian nation. Let's go on. That was sort of a rant, but it was important information. Also, the founders not only chose not to establish a federal denomination of Christianity, but also never intended the First Amendment to become a vehicle to promote a pluralism of other religions. So the First Amendment was not written concerning other world religions. The First Amendment was written concerning denominations within Christianity. Joseph Story wrote in his commentaries, "The real goal of the First Amendment was not to countenance or to promote or advance Mohammedism." So again, that's the way they referred to Islam back then, Mohammedism, because the adherents were followers of Muhammad, just like Christians are followers of Jesus Christ. There's a myth that says the word Christian means Christ-like. It doesn't mean Christ-like. It means Christ followers. Christians are followers of Jesus Christ. And so the founders, in all of their research, and they were scholarly men, and they did study the writings of Islam, and they came to the conclusion that the adherents of Islam were followers of Muhammad, and that's why they termed it Mohammedism. When you read their writings, that's when it's Islam, but they call it Mohammedism. And so he says, anyway, the First Amendment, this is what Joseph Story tells us, the First Amendment was not to countenance, much less advance, Mohammedism or Islam or Judaism or infidelity, which they referred to, atheism was infidelity to them, by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects. That's what the First Amendment, he tells us himself, he was there. These were individuals who knew the intent of the founders. And so he's writing and he's explaining that the First Amendment was written to exclude rivalry among Christian denominations. So it's not referring to world religions, although they had world religions in America at that time. Let's look and see what Dr. Benjamin Rush said. Dr. Benjamin Rush, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a physician, and he was a founding member of America's first Bible Society. And he was also organizer of America's first anti-slavery society. He said this: "Such is my veneration for every religion that reveals the attributes of the deity." So he says that he respects all of those religions at that time, not just Christianity. He says that his respect or his honor for every religion that reveals the attributes of the deity. He goes on, or further states of a state of reward or punishment, heaven or hell, and all of this stuff. Christianity teaches an afterlife. Islam teaches an afterlife. Some of the more Eastern religions, they teach an afterlife in a form of reincarnation. So he's saying that he had respect to all of those. He said that he would rather see the opinions of Confucius or Mohammed inculcated upon the youth than see them grow up wholly devoid of a system of religious principles. But the religion I mean to recommend in this place is that of the New Testament. All of its doctrines and precepts are calculated to promote the happiness of society and the safety and well-being of civil government. Isn't that interesting? To show, because many times the founding fathers, many of them are accused of being deists. In other words, a deist is someone who says, all right, God got the whole thing kicked off, but then he just kind of left us on our own, sort of like an absentee parent. He got this whole thing started, but he's not involved with the affairs of men. And so they accuse many of the founders of being deists. Well, this is not true. They honored the contribution of religion and belief systems in America. And to show that, he says, I'd rather someone teach the doctrines of Confucianism or Islam rather than atheism. He'd rather that the youth would be exposed to other belief systems rather than atheism. So they were against total unbelief. They allowed it. You can be here, but they didn't want atheism to influence this culture. Boy, how things have changed. And then also, there was a possibility of Muslims in government back then. And let's read this. There was a concern that religious groups other than Christians could enter into politics. In a debate in North Carolina ratifying convention in 1788, this was discussed. Many wish to know what religion shall be established. And the writer, this is the governor speaking, he said, I believe a majority of the community are Presbyterians. I am, for my part, against any exclusive establishment, but if there were any, I would prefer the Episcopal. The exclusion of religious tests is by many thought dangerous and impolitic. They suppose that if there be no religious test required, pagans, deists, and Mohammedans might obtain offices among us, and that the senators and representatives might all be pagans. So they were concerned about other belief systems entering into government, because some of our original founders they wrote and talked about how it was the duty of Christian citizens to elect other citizens to government. And boy, how that has changed. I mean, you talk about meeting with opposition. You say something like that on CNN or MSNBC or some of the mainstream news nowadays, right away, cries for separation of church and state will come. But back then, they said they believed that it was a duty of Christians to elect other Christians for office. Well, back then, there was some concern that other belief systems could come and be a part of the government system also. And he mentions some examples, pagans, deists, or Mohammedans, in other words, Islam. Well, what was also going on during the time of the foundings? We were founded and we obtained our freedom in 1776. But around this time, we were being pestered by the Barbary powers. We were heavily involved in what later became the Barbary Wars once Thomas Jefferson came into office, who was the fourth president of the United States, or the third president of the United States. Well, fourth, yes. Anyway, to brush up on my history. We're involved with the Barbary powers, which consisted of Northern Africa nations and also included Turkey. It was Tunis, Morocco, Turkey, Algiers, Tripoli, which was threatening us. We gained our independence from Britain, and now we're on our own. We don't have the protection of the British Navy, and so Barbary pirates were kidnapping many commercial sailors and holding them for ransom. In other words, what Islam refers to as the jizya, which is a tax that unbelievers pay to allow to remain alive or to allow to practice their religion. And so on the high seas and in the Mediterranean, the Barbary powers were coming against us and kidnapping many of our sailors, many of our vessels, because we didn't have the protection of the British Navy. And we're familiar with the word Tripoli, the name Tripoli, which again, northern, which is now Libya. If you've heard the Marine Corps hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our country's battles on the land and the seas. Well, where did that come from? Why were we in Tripoli? You know, it's interesting. I asked someone else that question about why we were in Tripoli, and they used it. They basically projected this modern mindset back into the 1700s. And they said we probably were, messing with somebody over there. Our foreign policy. I'm like, wait a minute, foreign policy? We didn't have any foreign policy back then. What kind of foreign policy that we had? We were a burgeoning nation. We were just born. We just got our freedom from Britain, and we're being attacked and fought, and our sailors and the commercial men are being kidnapped by these Barbary pirates. What did we do to them? Well, that's what it is. What happened is, once Thomas Jefferson became president, he says, I'd rather pay millions in defense rather than a dime to tribute or jizya. That's what they called it, tribute back then. And so what he did is the Navy that was built under Adams, Jefferson put the Marines on those naval vessels and sent them over to Tripoli to teach them a lesson. It's interesting. Adams didn't want to get involved with this war. So under 4 presidents, under Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, we had to deal with these Barbary powers. But under Jefferson, that's when we went to war. That's where the Barbary Wars. We went to war with them to teach them a lesson. And so we paid out of our U.S. Treasury large amounts of money. We built frigates for them. We paid lots of money out of our treasury to them to release captured. They took our sailors and many of our men as hostage, and then we had to release and negotiate. And Jefferson and Madison, I think it was Jefferson and Adams, who were ambassadors at that time to Britain and France, respectively. They met with the leaders of these Barbary powers and asked them, what did we do to you? Why are you doing this to us? Why are you sinking our vessels and kidnapping our individuals and holding us hostage? We've done nothing to you. And their reply, written in the congressional records, they were saying that the response that these Muslim leaders gave them says it was founded upon the laws of Mohammed, who was the prophet of Islam, and that the followers of Islam must fight against unbelievers. And they were allowed to capture them, and they allowed to kill them, and they were allowed to take them into slavery. This is some of the things that the founding fathers talk about. You need to go and look that up. You need to find out about the Barbary Wars and read that entirety, and you'll see that this is what was taking place at the time when many of this was writing. And so some of our citizens were concerned that, hey, what if some of these individuals get into politics? That'll be a great concern. So we had a long conflict, a long struggle with the Barbary powers, and we get combat fatigue in our day. We talk about long wars. We just made a treaty with the Taliban to pull out of Afghanistan. It's like we haven't learned anything from the Treaty of Tripoli and how the Treaty of Tripoli was broken by the Barbary powers. We think that we have long wars. Just think about the long wars they had. That's one of the things that Adam said, that he didn't want to get involved in this, because if he got involved with it, he was afraid that we would never stop fighting these individuals. Look that up also. That's what he said. But once Jefferson became president, he says, I can't do it. I'd rather put the millions into defense than into tribute. That's the setting that we're in here when we're talking about being concerned about the possibility of Muslims getting in the government back then. Let's move on. Okay, here we are. They go on to say, but it is objected that the people of America may perhaps choose representatives who have no religion at all, and that pagans and Mohammedans may be admitted into offices. But it is never to be supposed that the people of America will trust their dearest rights to persons who have no religion at all. So they were saying, they were writing that it's possible that the people of America may choose atheists, Muslims, followers of Muhammad to be admitted into office. They said that's, it's a possibility because we live in a pluralistic society. And because of Christianity, there's tolerance for many belief systems. But they also go on to say, but it is never to be supposed that the people of America will trust their dearest rights to persons who have no religion at all. So the founding fathers anticipated that Muslims and other people of belief systems will get in, but they never wanted atheists in office. That's interesting. They go on to say, Governor Samuel Johnston, he further states, and this is in many of their committees and their talks, and these things were written down. He explains how it would be possible for a Muslim to get in office. He says it is apprehended that Jews, Mohammedans, pagans may be elected to high offices under the government of the United States. Those who are Mohammedans can never be elected to office of president or to other high office, but in one of two cases. So he's going to cite two ways that a Muslim could be elected into high office or even the president of the United States. The first one, he says, is if the people of America lay aside the Christian religion altogether. That's how it can happen. So again, going back to what some of the earlier fathers say, that it was the duty of Christians to elect Christians into office. Well, he's just saying because the founding fathers, they had amazing foresight. I'm not saying that they were prophets or anything and they could speak into the future, but they were very wise men, and they were saying, okay, as this experiment grows, it's possible that one day different groups of people will be elected in office. And so he's saying the only way that will happen is if the majority of the Christians in the nation reject their Christian religion, and then they can vote for somebody who is not of a Christian belief. Then he says, look at what he says though. Should this unfortunately take place, the people will choose such men as think as they do themselves. So in other words, the majority of a nation would have to reject Christianity and elect into office somebody who reflects their beliefs. Then he says another way that this could happen. Another case is if any person of such description, whether they be a Muslim or Hindu or of that description, notwithstanding their religion or in spite of their religion, they acquire the confidence and the esteem of the people of America by their good conduct and practice of virtue. They may be chosen. So in other words, if they have an ideology that is contrary to Christianity, or if they have an ideology that is peaceful and that is conducive to a peaceful society, and they have good conduct and good behavior, then it's possible for them to be elected. Let's move on. So having said that, let's look at this. This is why I'm talking about. First of all, I asked the question, is Islam a peaceful religion? Or I'm sorry, I ask, is Islam a religion? Well, we answer that question, yes. The Quran even says it's a religion. Then the question always is asked, is Islam a peaceful religion? Or is Islam a violent religion? Well, that's where many Americans are divided. Some say, well, Islam is a peaceful religion. And others say, well, it's a violent religion. Well, right away, what happens is you get into the whole argument of dealing with Muslims. Because right away, someone will say, well, I know lots of peaceful Muslims. Has nothing to do with the Muslim. We're talking about the ideology, the belief system. Because Islam, being a religion, is just like any other religion. Whether it be Islam, whether it be Christianity, whether it be Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever the practice, all adherents do not follow strictly according to the doctrines of their belief system. All Christians do not love their enemy. But the Bible clearly teaches, love your enemy, pray for those who despitefully use you. All Christians don't do that. The Bible also gives a command. When he gave his command to his disciples to go therefore into all the world and preach the gospel. Well, some might say, well, that was just to the apostles. Well, it's a mandate to all of us. He says, I'm with you always until the end of the earth. So every believer has an obligation to share their faith, to tell people the gospel of Jesus Christ. But you know what? All Christians don't do that. The Bible says, thou shalt not commit adultery. You know what? There's lots of Christians who commit adultery. There's lots of Christians who lie and cheat and steal, all of these things. So I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying every Christian doesn't follow all the tenets of their belief system. Neither does every Muslim follow all the tenets of their religious system. So it's not about the Muslim. The Muslim doesn't represent Islam. Muhammad represents Islam. The Christian doesn't represent Christianity, although we're called light and salt. But if you want to see true Christianity, you look and see what Jesus taught his disciples and those who immediately followed him, Paul and Peter and James and John, and what they did. And that reflects the true teachings of Christianity. And we're called, as Christians, we're called to follow that. We're called to deny ourselves, to take up the cross and follow Jesus. Jesus, as a matter of fact, says if you don't, every day, if you do not deny yourself, if you do not take up the cross and follow me, then you cannot be my disciple. That's what Jesus teaches. Well, obviously, many of us would be disqualified from that. But still, we believe in Jesus Christ. We're followers of Jesus Christ. We're not perfect. And neither is there a perfect Muslim. The only perfect Muslim is Muhammad. According to their scriptures, Muhammad is the perfect example to all humanity. So if you want to see what Islam really is, you see what Muhammad did and his immediate followers, his companions, what they refer to as the Salafi, Abu Bakr, who became the successor to Muhammad, and then Umar, who was a general, one of his generals who became a successor or caliph, and then Uthman after him, and then Ali. Abu Bakr, who was an older man, he was Muhammad's father-in-law. The entire 2 years of his succession or his caliphate, the entire 2 years, he fought what was known as the Ridda Wars or the Apostasy Wars, which was fought against Muslims. Because after Muhammad's death, many in that region says, hey, you know, Muhammad is gone. He's the leader. He started this whole thing. He's gone. I'm going back to my normal way of life. I'm through with this. I'm going to leave Islam. Abu Bakr says, no, you're not. And he fought and he killed thousands of Muslims to return them back to the fold. It's called the Ridda Wars, the Apostasy Wars. This is according to many of their documents. These were the immediate followers of the founder of Islam, to find out if the religion is peaceful. Some may say, well, yes, the religion initially was peaceful when Muhammad started it. Yep. For 12 or 13 years, he tried to pass on his message peacefully, and he only gained, according to their sources, anywhere from 70 to to 200 followers, including their family members. So he had 70 followers. But once he entered into Medina, and once he gained power, and once he became a prophet and a king and a warlord, all bets were off. The peaceful portions of the Quran were abrogated or canceled out by the Medinan verses, and then that's when Islam really started to grow. So we see again, if this doctrine of abrogation is legitimate, we have to ask these questions. So from 622 to 632, at the time of Muhammad's death, Islam had conquered all of Saudi Arabia, or all of Arabia. And then in 634, it conquers Syria. And then it starts to advance. Now, when you read the writings of some Islamic apologists, in other words, they're Westerners, and they try to whitewash the history of Islam, such as Karen Armstrong and John Esposito, and many of them write, they'll talk about expansion. Just Islam just expanded because it was just so wonderful and beautiful, and everywhere it went, people accepted it. But when you read the writings of others, it talk about conquest. When you read their own writings, they talk about how they conquered. They saw it as a glorious thing, a wonderful thing. So they conquered Syria in 634. They conquered Jerusalem in 636, Egypt 642, and all of North Africa by 647. And then in Spain, 711, they went in from North Africa, they went up into Spain. And of course, they took up all of Spain, and they ruled over Spain from 711 all the way up to 1492 until they were expelled by Ferdinand and Isabella. And then also 732, they invaded into France, and they met with Charles Martel there, who was the hammer, who turned them back, or else they would have spread Islam all throughout the West at that time. And then in 1453, they conquered the Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire. You had the Western Roman Empire, which is in Rome, and then the Byzantine Empire. After they split, we find, which was in the Turkish region, or in other words, Asia Minor. And to show the importance of this, let's just talk to Christians. Asia Minor, if you know your geography, Asia Minor is where the Apostle Paul did most of his missionary work and established many of those churches: Ephesus, Galatia, Philippi, all of those, Cappadocia. He just went throughout. The gospel spread through all of those regions. Remember, signs and wonders and miracles were being performed in Ephesus and many of those areas. And then also remember, in the book of Revelation, John the Revelator writes to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. And Jesus, the first 3 chapters, the resurrected, glorified Jesus spoke directly to those churches in Asia Minor. That's the region that we're talking about. That's where Christianity thrived. But now that area is all Islamic. How did that happen? You ask yourself a question. How did that happen? Was that just a peaceful transfer of power? Did all of a sudden over the years, the Christians of that region who were founded by the Apostle Paul and preached to by Peter, and letters written to them, and the signs and wonders and miracles and powers, and the cities being converted, and Jesus speaking to the 7 churches, you mean all of a sudden that just becomes Islamic through attrition, just because people thought, well, I'm tired of that Christian message, time to move on to something else? Are we really supposed to believe that? Well, we see that it's the 1400 years of Islamic history, and so that's why we need to ask these questions. Is Islam a peaceful religion? Because in our day, we have many Muslims that are entering into politics. You have the USCMO, which is the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, which was founded in 2014, which is basically it's a political party. So the Muslim Brotherhood in America formed their own political party called the USCMO in 2014, made up of CARE and ISNA and IMPACT. CARE, as many of you know, is the Council on American Islamic Relations. ISNA is the Islamic Islamic Society of North America, Impact. There's a Muslim Public Affairs Council. And so they formed this coalition of Muslims to put an emphasis on Muslims voting and being a part of the electoral process, and also training and putting Muslim politicians in place so that they can influence American culture. Of course, we know that in 2018, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, we know that they came to national attention, but there are over 90 Muslims who gained office throughout the United States in other positions as mayor and school boards and other capacities, which the media doesn't talk much about. Well, there are some Muslim groups involved with this USCMO that have stated that they want to see 5,000 Muslims run for office in the 2020 election. 5,000 Muslims they want. And so once they get in, what we can see, the concern that the founders had and the citizens of that time during the Barbary powers, they were like, what if some of the followers of this belief system get into politics? Well, we see it happening in our day. They are entering into politics. And Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they are not coming in peaceful. They are not coming in quiet. They are expressing their fundamentalist views. Sometimes people call them radical. But, radical just means root, but it just means fundamental. This is what Islam believes. This is what they teach, and we see that they're coming in and they're expressing these various groups, CARE, ISNA, MSA, Muslim Student Association. They are what's known as a unindicted co-conspirators in the Holy Land Foundation trial, which took place in 2007 and 2008, where 5 individuals were indicted and sent to prison for raising money to fund Hamas. They were raising money in the United States, and they were giving that money to Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization, designated by the State Department in 1995 to be a terrorist organization. This Holy Land Foundation was raising funds in America to give to Hamas, and CARE and ISNA and all of these Muslim organizations, because there was a document that was discovered in 2004 in a raid in Annandale, Virginia, at the house of a fellow by the name of Ishmael al-Barasi. And in this raid, the authorities found what they called the Muslim Brotherhood treasure trove. And they had all of these documents, 80 to 85 banker boxes full of Muslim Brotherhood documents explaining their expressed goals and desires in the United States. And it talks about their founding, the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 in Egypt, and then how they advanced and found their way throughout many nations, and then, of course, in the United States. And it is these groups. So 5 of these individuals involved in these groups, the Muslim Brotherhood in America, went to prison. But then also there were many organizations, like 100-something other organizations, 300-something individuals who were unindicted. They didn't go to prison. The Holy Land Foundation case was shut down in 2009 so that the investigation was squashed. And I won't go into any further detail with that. You can look up information to find out why that Holy Land trial was shut down. But in some of these documents, there was one document called the Explanatory Memorandum for the Group in North America. It was written by Mohammed in May 22nd, 1991. And part of it talks about the goal of this group in North America. And their goal was a civilization jihad process to eliminate and sabotage our miserable house, referring to America as a miserable house, by their hands, the Muslims, and also by the inhabitants of America. The there was referring to our U.S. government, our academia, our politicians, our school systems, other people by their hands. That's what it's referring to, the American hands, and by the hands of the believers, so that Allah's religion may conquer and be over all other religions on earth. This is their written, express sentiments. This is what they say. These are the individuals who are training individuals to get into the political process. And so these are questions that need to be asked. It's not just your run of the mill, because many times we always say, well, I know a Muslim guy, he's a nice guy, I work with him. We all do. We all know nice Muslims. But they're not the ones who wrote the explanatory memorandum. They're not the one who are leading this cause. Because part of the explanatory memorandum says that this movement is led by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt. This movement in America and throughout is led by the Muslim Brotherhood. So, having said all of that, these are the individuals who are driving the machine. These are the individuals who are putting people in places of office. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, their devotion is to the Muslim Brotherhood and to CARE and to Impact and ISNA and all those organizations. They go and they speak at them. So they're not just your run-of-the-mill Muslim who just wants to live peacefully, who want to send their children to school and get along with everyone. Because not all Muslims are terrorists. I say that, and many other people teach us, not all Muslims are terrorists. But the terrorists who are out there follow a belief system. They follow an ideology. And we see what this ideology has done, because we have 1,400 years of their history written from them and also from the people who they conquered. Those are primary sources. These are the people who are getting involved with the voting process, the election process. These are the people that are putting their candidates up to run for office. And so we are to be concerned about that. And they also express, as I mentioned, that they want 5,000 Muslim men and women to enter into office, the 2020 cycle, so that they can defeat Donald Trump. But look at their track record. Look at their record of conquest, and think about the doctrine of abrogation, to where the peaceful versions or peaceful verses of the Quran are canceled out by the more violent verses of the Quran. In other words, that's what they live by. Let's see and I'm going to finish this up. I know I went long, but hopefully you gain something out of this. Because Islam is Muhammad. Islam is not nice Muslims who live in America. They may or may not know this. They may or may not agree with this. They may or may not live this. It could be like many Christians in America who say they're a Christian, but they can't tell you why. Well, I went to church when I was little. So they sort of give a nod. So they make sure they have an obligation to go to church every Sunday. There are many Muslims like that also in America and throughout the world and throughout the West. But Islam is not about them. Islam is Muhammad. Islam, there's Dr. Bill Warner. He's a doctor. He's a scientist. And he loves numbers, and he's crunched the numbers. He says Islam is 86% Muhammad and 14% Allah. Think about that for a second. So Islam is Muhammad. Look at what he says. Allah's apostle says, I have been ordered, according to him by Muhammad, to fight against the people until they testify that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah, and that Muhammad is Allah's apostle, and offer the prayers perfectly and give the obligatory charity. So if they perform that, then they save their lives and property from me, except for Islamic laws, which we know as Sharia, which means the path. It just means Islamic laws. And then their reckoning or accounts will be done by Allah. That's found in Sahih Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari is a volume of work. It is considered a hadith. What they have is that they have the Quran which are supposed to be the words of Allah, but and certainly in many others' opinions, and in my opinion, because I've read the Quran, I have read the Hadith, and I've read the biographies of Muhammad. The Quran are supposed to be the words of Allah, but basically it's just Muhammad's words and thoughts that he inserts into the mouth of Allah. Anyway, having said that, their sources are the Quran, which is supposed to be the words of Allah, the Hadith, which is the traditions. Everything that Muhammad said and everything that Muhammad did was written down by his companions. Those are the Hadith. Those are Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and Sahih just means authenticated, or these are authorities. They're valid. And then you also have the biography, which is the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad. It tells about his origins, his life, his childhood, all the way through. It's supposed to be his genealogy. These are the sources. This is what's known as the Sharia. Well, the Sahih Bukhari, Volume 1, Book 2, number 24, says this. This is what Muhammad said, that he has been ordered to fight against people, in other words, until they become Muslims. And then also look at what Sahih Muslim says. This is one of Muhammad's companions. These are transmissions, basically credible transmissions. This individual heard Muhammad say, and he passes it on. This is what this fellow Jabbar bin Abdullah, he reported. He said, I heard the messenger of Allah say, a section of my people will not cease fighting for truth and will prevail till the day of resurrection. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why I'm talking about this. Because someone might say, well, Muhammad is dead. He died 1400 years ago. Whatever he said doesn't matter. It doesn't count anymore. He's dead. He's gone. If he fought wars while he's alive or not, I don't know. I don't care. But here, he talks about his followers. The messenger of Allah is saying that there's a section. So yes, we're not saying all Muslims are violent. We're not saying all Muslims are jihadists. But there are a faction. Many times people say, oh, it's just it's just a handful of them. Well, a handful of 1.6 billion, you do the math. It doesn't matter. But he says here, a section. He didn't say all, so it's a section. A faction of my people will not cease fighting for truth and will prevail. How long? Till the day of resurrection. Because remember, Christians, they believe in a resurrection. They believe that Jesus will come back and all those who are in the grave will be resurrected. Well, Islam also has eschatological belief system and views. They have teachings on the last days. They have teachings on what's going to happen when Jesus comes back. And I behoove you to look that up also. The Shia 12ers, which is a Shia sect. They believe in the Mahdi. Both groups, Sunni and Shia, believe in the Mahdi. So they have an end time scenario, end time belief. They also believe in the day of resurrection. And Muhammad was saying that there's going to be a portion of his followers that are going to be fighting. So he's dead, he's gone. Whether he fought wars, his biography details all of the wars that he fought. Someone might say he's dead and gone, but he's in his predictions, he's saying there's a faction of his followers that are going to fight until the day of resurrection. That means they're going to keep on fighting until the end. Well, we see that. We see that kinetic war. We see that jihad by Al-Qaeda, by the Taliban, by Boko Haram, by Al-Shabaab, by Tablighi Jamaat, and by many others who are in battle. ISIS, that we say that we have subdued. We might have subdued them in Syria, but they're, according to some sources, they're spread out throughout 35 other nations. And so we see that they're obviously fighting vis-a-vis in the way of Allah. They're fighting physically, fighting people where they can find them. They're chopping off their heads and burning them alive and chopping off their fingers and toes and doing all types of atrocities. We see it in the news. We see it happen. But then there's also what's considered a cultural jihad. a cultural jihad, a civilization. Robert Spencer coined it as a stealth jihad, where they get into your systems, when they get into your government, where they have implemented themselves into universities and into academia and the media, and they say, well, let's go another way. And let me shut this down, but I have to make this analogy. You have Marxism, which is another violent ideology. Karl Marx, he didn't carry out this violent, what he thought was going to be a movement of the proletariat, the working class, who was going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, was overthrow the rich, the capitalists. That's his prediction. They were going to rise up and there was going to be a revolution and cast that off. Well, Marx never killed anybody. He never did it. But it was his belief system. Well, his belief system was carried out under Lenin and Stalin, and it was ugly, and it was military, and it was forceful, and it was violent, and millions of people lost their lives by carrying out the ideology in the former USSR, and then other nations around the world, China under Mao, and Pol Pot, and Cuba under Castro. They carried out this ideology physically, and many people died for it. But with the power and the might of the Western powers, Britain and the United States, after we went to war and defeated the ideologies of communism and all of those things, and they found out that communism cannot be spread through military might. So then they came in with what was called cultural Marxism, brought in by a fellow by Antonio Gramsci, and then also further by a fellow by the name of Herbert Marcuse. And what they talked about, the long march through the institutions, how they would come in civilizational Marxism, where they would get into the churches and they would get into our culture and in academia and in Hollywood, and they would a slow march and they would influence the minds of the individuals, and then they would make that civilization a condition to where the people's minds would readily receive Marxism. Well, that's why we have what's called a red-green axis. Red being Marxism, green being the Islamist or Islamic ideology. They have similar goals and similar views. That's why they have merged together. They have come together to have civilizational Marxism or civilizational jihad, to where they come into our culture, condition the minds of the people, and then have their dreams and goals realized in the end. This is what I'm talking about. Is Islam a peaceful religion? Well, it started out peaceful with Muhammad, and when it wasn't accepted or embraced, then it morphed into something different. And we see that carried them for 1400 years, and we see many of their followers carrying that belief out throughout the world against Jews, Christians, and other non-Muslims, and sometimes against their own people who they deem not Islamic enough for them. But we also have the founder of the religion, who says that there's going to be a section of my people, whether it be a handful, whether it be many, whether it be few, doesn't matter, who are going to continue this fight until the day of resurrection. Why can't we question that? Why do we have to close our mouths and be afraid and say, oh, we can't say anything about it because you might offend a Muslim, or we might be tagged a homophobe, or I'm sorry, an Islamophobe, or a hater, or a bigot, or oppressive? Why can't we just ask the question? That's why I made this video. I hope you think about it. I hope you contemplate on it a little bit. I think I'm finished. Enough said. God bless you. Goodbye.